The boardroom on the 43rd floor gleamed under recessed lighting, all glass and polished mahogany, a cathedral to corporate ambition. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled in geometric patterns of steel and concrete, punctuated by the golden hour light that made even the ugliest buildings look momentarily sacred. Inside, 12 executives sat around an oval table, their voices sharp with impatience, their expensive suits crisp despite the late hour. At the head of the table, Marcus Whitmore leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, watching his team argue about quarterly projections with the detached amusement of someone who already knew the outcome. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. The door opened, and Daniel Sullivan entered with his cleaning cart, the wheels squeaking softly against the hardwood floor. He was 47 years old, though he looked older in the harsh fluorescent light of the service corridors. His gray custodian's uniform hung loose on his thin frame, and his hands, scarred and calloused from years of work, gripped the cart handle with practiced ease. He'd learned long ago to make himself invisible in rooms like this, to move along the periphery like a shadow, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces while the important people discussed important things. "Can this wait?" Marcus Whitmore's voice cut through the room, sharp as broken glass. He hadn't looked up from his phone, but his irritation filled the space like smoke. "We're in the middle of something." Daniel paused, his cart halfway through the door. "I'm sorry, sir. Maintenance schedule says." "I don't care what the schedule says." Marcus finally looked up, his gray eyes cold and assessing. "We're discussing a $60 million merger. Your trash bins can wait 30 minutes. The other executives had fallen silent, watching the exchange with the mild interest of people grateful for any distraction from spreadsheets and profit margins. Jennifer Chun, the CFO, glanced at her watch. Robert Hastings, VP of Operations, smirked into his coffee cup. They'd all seen Marcus do this before, assert dominance over someone powerless, a small demonstration of the hierarchy that governed their world. Daniel felt heat rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. "Of course, sir. I'll come back later." He began to back out, pulling his cart with him, when his elbow caught the corner of a picture frame he'd hung on the handle, a faded photograph of his daughter, Emma, at her high school graduation. The frame clattered to the floor, and from beneath it, a folded piece of sheet music slipped out, yellowed with age. Marcus stood, walking around the table with the measured pace of a predator. He picked up the sheet music, unfolding it with deliberate slowness. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, Number 2. He read the title aloud, then looked at Daniel with something between curiosity and contempt. "You read music?" "I used to." Daniel's voice was quiet, barely audible over the hum of the building's ventilation system. "Used to." Marcus held up the paper, examining it like evidence in a trial. "Let me guess. High school band? Community theater?" The executives chuckled, a sound like breaking ice. "Or maybe you're one of those people who thinks watching YouTube tutorials makes you a musician." Daniel didn't answer. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath weathered skin. He could feel the eyes on him, could sense the entertainment value he represented in this moment. The janitor with delusions of grandeur, the working-class man who'd forgotten his place. Marcus walked to the corner of the boardroom, where a Steinway grand piano sat, black and pristine, more decorative than functional. It had been installed 3 years ago when the company renovated the executive floor, a symbol of cultural sophistication that no one ever played. "Tell you what, Daniel." Marcus's voice dripped with false generosity. "I'll make you a deal. You play this piece right now perfectly and I'll triple your salary. I'll make you facilities director. Hell, I'll invite you to the next shareholders meeting." The room erupted in scattered laughter, but it died quickly when they saw Marcus wasn't joking. His expression had shifted into something sharper, more calculating. This wasn't just mockery anymore. It was a test, a public execution designed to remind everyone present of their place in the world's order. "But," Marcus continued, raising one finger, "if you can't play it, if you fail, you're fired." Right here, right now. No severance, no reference letter. Nothing. You walk out of this building tonight and never come back. Jennifer Chun shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Marcus, maybe we should. I'm making a point about excellence, Jennifer. Marcus didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on Daniel, challenging, daring, absolute. About the difference between aspiration and ability. About knowing your limitations. He gestured toward the piano. So what do you say, Daniel? Do you want to show us what you've got? Or do you want to admit that some dreams are meant to stay dreams and get back to your trash bins? Daniel stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. The sheet music lay on the table between them like a gauntlet. In his mind, he heard a dozen voices from a dozen different years. His mother telling him to practice, his teacher Mrs. Kowalski praising his natural talent, his wife Sarah asking him why he'd given up, his daughter Emma wondering aloud why her father cleaned offices when he could have been so much more. The room smelled of expensive cologne and coffee, of leather and ambition. Through the windows, the sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every decision he'd made that had led him to this moment. This room, this challenge, this impossible choice between dignity and survival. I'll need a moment, Daniel said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. To remember. Marcus checked his watch, a platinum Patek Philippe that cost more than Daniel earned in a year. You have 5 minutes. Use them wisely. He returned to his seat, crossing his legs with casual confidence, the posture of a man who'd already won. Daniel approached the piano slowly, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood. The instrument was beautiful up close, its surface so polished he could see his reflection. Older, more tired, more defeated than he remembered being. He lifted the fallboard with careful reverence, revealing the keys, ivory and ebony, perfectly maintained despite their disuse. His fingers hovered over them, not quite touching, as if the contact might burn. Robert Hastings leaned toward Jennifer and whispered, "This is cruel, even for Marcus." "Then stop him," she whispered back. Robert shrugged. "Not my problem." Daniel sat down on the bench, adjusting its height with the small lever underneath. The motion was automatic muscle memory from decades ago. He tested middle C, a single note that rang out in the boardroom like a bell, pure and clear and impossibly lonely. The executives watched in silence now, some uncomfortable, others fascinated. All of them complicit in whatever was about to unfold. 5 minutes felt like 5 seconds. Marcus stood again, buttoning his suit jacket. "Time's up, Daniel. Either play or leave." Daniel placed his hands on the keys, fingers finding their positions through instinct more than thought. He closed his eyes, and for just a moment he wasn't in this boardroom anymore. He was 17 years old, performing at the state competition, his mother in the front row with tears streaming down her face. He was 23, playing at his wedding while Sarah walked down the aisle. He was 31, teaching Emma her first scales on their second-hand upright piano, her small hands struggling to stretch across the octave. And then he began to play. The first notes of Chopin's nocturne rose into the air like prayers, delicate and haunting, each one perfectly placed, perfectly timed. Daniel's hands moved across the keys with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone who'd spent 20 years pushing mops and emptying wastebaskets. The melody wove through the boardroom, transforming the space from a temple of commerce into something older, something sacred. His left hand maintained the steady triplet accompaniment while his right hand sang out the nostalgic theme, the notes bending and swaying like branches in wind. Marcus's expression changed. The smugness drained away, replaced by something harder to define. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been anger or recognition or fear. He'd expected incompetence, had anticipated the pleasure of being proven right about the natural order of things. Instead, he was witnessing something he couldn't explain, something that challenged every assumption he'd built his identity around. The other executives leaned forward in their chairs. Jennifer Chen's hand had moved to her chest, as if the music had struck something deep inside her. Robert Hastings had stopped smirking. Even the youngest executive, Thomas Park, fresh from his Ivy League MBA program, looked shaken, as if he'd glimpsed something beyond the narrow scope of his ambition. Daniel played on, his eyes still closed, lost in the mathematics of emotion that was Chopin's genius. The piece built toward its climax, the melody becoming more ornate, more expressive, the left hand's accompaniment growing fuller and more complex. His fingers found every trill, every grace note, every subtle dynamic shift that separated competent playing from artistry. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not from the physical effort but from the emotional exposure, the vulnerability of revealing this hidden part of himself to people who'd never seen him as anything more than invisible. The middle section arrived, darker and more passionate, the key shifting to be major, the mood becoming urgent and searching. Daniel's hands moved faster now, the notes cascading over each other like water over stones. Each phrase a question asked and answered, each harmonic progression a small revelation. The piece was about longing, about the ache of beautiful things that couldn't last, about the gap between what we dream and what we live. In the audience of 12, something had shifted. This was no longer entertainment. This was testimony, confession, indictment. Every note Daniel played accused them of blindness, of the casual cruelty that came from never having to see the people who existed below their line of sight. The janitor wasn't supposed to have this talent, depth, a history that included beauty and loss and aspirations larger than his job description. It was easier when the service workers stayed invisible, when you could ignore the fullness of their interior lives. The piece returned to its opening theme, the melody now familiar but somehow changed by everything that had come between. Daniel played the final phrases with devastating tenderness, each note released with reluctance, as if he knew that when the music stopped, he'd have to return to being who he was, or who they decided he was. The last chord hung in the air, sustained by the piano's resonance, and by the silence of 12 people who'd forgotten how to breathe. Daniel opened his eyes. His hands remained on the keys for a moment longer, then slowly withdrew. He stood, closed the fallboard with the same careful reverence he'd used to open it, and turned to face Marcus Whitmore. The CO's face had gone pale. His jaw was set, his hands gripped the edge of the table. For several seconds, no one spoke. The room felt charged, electric, as if reality itself had been temporarily suspended and no one quite knew how to restart it. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Jennifer Chen's voice broke the silence, soft with genuine wonder. Daniel looked at her, then at Marcus, then at his cart waiting by the door. "Juilliard," he said quietly. "Full scholarship. Class of 2001. The words landed like stones in still water, their implications rippling outward. Robert Hastings straightened in his chair. Thomas Park's mouth opened slightly. Marcus remained perfectly still, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, reassessment, the mental machinery of a man trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped away from him. "Then why?" Jennifer started to ask, but Daniel cut her off with a small shake of his head. "Life happens," he said. "Student loans, medical bills, a daughter who needed things more than I needed to play piano." His voice carried no bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of someone who'd long ago made peace with his choices. "You do what you have to do." Marcus finally found his voice. That was adequate. The word cost him something to say. "You fulfilled the terms of our agreement. Starting Monday, you'll report to Jennifer as facilities director. Salary of $90,000 annually. We'll have HR process the paperwork." But there was something in his tone that wasn't quite congratulation, more like resentment, like a man forced to honor a bet he'd expected to win. He gathered his papers with sharp, precise movements, signaling the meeting's end. "We're done here. Everyone out." The executives filed out slowly, several of them glancing back at Daniel as they left, their expressions a mixture of admiration and discomfort. Jennifer paused at the door. "That was extraordinary," she said. "Really. I'd love to hear more about." "Jennifer." Marcus's voice was ice. "We have that call with Tokyo in 10 minutes. She nodded, gave Daniel one more look, apologetic, curious, troubled, and left. Alone in the boardroom, Daniel and Marcus faced each other across the Steinway Grand. The sun had nearly set now, the room falling into shadow, the city lights beginning their nightly emergence. Daniel could feel the exhaustion settling into his bones, the adrenaline fading to leave behind the familiar ache of being 47 and tired and uncertain about what would happen next. "You humiliated me," Marcus said finally. His voice was quiet, controlled, but underneath it ran a current of something darker. "In front of my entire executive team. You asked me to play," Daniel replied. "I played. You should have refused. You should have known your place." Marcus walked to the window, his back to Daniel, his reflection visible in the glass. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The questions you've raised? People like you aren't supposed to be complicated. You're supposed to be simple, predictable. You're supposed to fit into the box we've assigned you." Daniel picked up the photograph of Emma from where it had fallen, tucking it carefully back into his pocket along with the sheet music. "People like me," he said softly, "are just people. That's all we ever were." Marcus turned, and in the dying light, his expression was hard to read. Anger and grudging respect and something that might have been fear. "Be here Monday at 8 a.m. Don't make me regret this." "I won't, sir." "And Daniel?" Marcus's voice stopped him at the door. "Don't ever play that piano again." Daniel nodded once and left, pushing his cart down the hallway toward the service elevator. Behind him, the boardroom fell dark, the piano standing silent in the shadows like a witness to something that couldn't quite be named. Not victory, not defeat, but something in between, something that would ripple outward in ways neither man could yet imagine. The elevator descended, and through its glass walls, Daniel watched the building's floors pass by. Office after office, corridor after corridor, all the spaces he'd cleaned for 20 years. All the rooms where people had lived their important lives while he'd existed in the margins. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he saw someone other than just a janitor. He saw Daniel Sullivan, 47 years old, Juilliard graduate, father, widower, survivor, musician. The doors opened onto the basement level, where the maintenance staff kept their lockers and took their breaks. Carlos Martinez looked up from his coffee, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Hey, Daniel. You're late. I was about to start the north wing myself." "Something came up," Daniel said. He opened his locker, storing his cart, hanging up his vest. His hands were shaking slightly, the reality of what had just happened beginning to sink in. I think something big just happened, Carlos." "Good big or bad big?" Daniel thought about Marcus's face, about the way the music had filled the boardroom, about the weight of promises made by powerful men. "I don't know yet." In his pocket, his phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Hope you're having a good night, Dad. Love you." He smiled, typed back a response, then stared at the photograph of her graduation day. She'd asked him once why he'd given up music, and he'd told her the truth, that some sacrifices were worth making, that love sometimes meant setting aside your dreams so someone else could chase theirs. She was finishing her residency now, would be a doctor by next year, proof that his choices had mattered. But as he rode the bus home that night, watching the city scroll past his window, Daniel couldn't help but wonder what the cost had been. Not just to his career or his dreams, but to some essential part of himself that had been sleeping for 20 years and had suddenly, unexpectedly, violently awakened. The music still echoed in his head, the notes still alive in his fingertips. He'd forgotten how it felt to be whole, to be seen, to exist in the world as something more than his function. His apartment was dark when he arrived, small and cluttered with the accumulation of 2 decades of survival. But on the table by the window sat his upright piano, secondhand and out of tune, covered with a sheet. He hadn't played it since Sarah died, hadn't been able to bear the memories it held. Now he pulled off the sheet, opened the lid and sat down. The keys felt different from the Steinway, stiffer, less responsive, several notes slightly flat. But they were his, had always been his, waiting patiently for him to return. He played middle C, then a scale, then a few bars of the nocturne. The sound filled his small living room, leaked out through the thin walls to where his neighbors lived their own complicated lives. And as Daniel played, really played, for the first time in years, he understood that something had broken today. Some carefully maintained barrier between the life he'd lived and the life he'd left behind. Marcus Whitmore thought he'd won a game, thought he'd successfully put Daniel in his place even while elevating his title. But what Marcus couldn't understand from his position at the top of the world, was that you couldn't erase what someone was by deciding what they were worth. The music swelled in the darkness, and Daniel Sullivan, janitor and Juilliard graduate, father and widower, invisible man made suddenly visible, played on. Monday morning arrived with the gray weight of uncertainty. Daniel stood outside Whitmore Industries at 7:45, wearing the only suit he owned, a navy blue two-piece from Goodwill that didn't quite fit his shoulders, purchased 6 years ago for Sarah's funeral. The building rose above him like a glass and steel monument to ambition, its 48 floors reflecting the overcast sky in endless repetition. He'd entered through these doors 1,000 times before, but always through the service entrance on 3rd Avenue, always in his gray uniform, always invisible. Today, he walked through the main entrance. The lobby was a cathedral of capitalism. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness, suspended art installations that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, a coffee bar where lattes went for $8 and no one blinked. Daniel had cleaned this space countless times, always after hours, always when the important people had gone home. Now he stood among them, clutching a worn leather messenger bag that had belonged to Sarah, trying to look like he belonged. "Can I help you?" The security guard, Marcus Washington, no relation to the CEO, looked at him with polite confusion. They'd worked the same building for 15 years, had shared coffee breaks and complained about management together, but Marcus didn't recognize him out of uniform. "It's me, Marcus. Daniel Sullivan." Recognition dawned slowly, followed by surprise. "Danny? Man, I didn't... What are you doing here? You got a meeting or something?" "Something like that." Daniel showed him the email HR had sent late Sunday night. Report to 43rd floor, 8 a.m., Director of Facilities Orientation. Marcus's eyebrows rose. "You got promoted? To director?" He laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Man, that's wild. Good for you, Danny. Really. About damn time they recognized your work." But there was something in his voice, some note of confusion or maybe even hurt, as if Daniel's sudden elevation had somehow betrayed their shared status as invisible men. Daniel felt it too. The guilt of leaving behind, the strange shame of rising while others stayed submerged. The elevator ride to the 43rd floor lasted an eternity. Daniel stood alone in the brushed steel box, watching the numbers climb, watching his reflection multiply in the mirrored walls. He looked small, out of place, like a child wearing his father's clothes. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. He shoved them in his pockets, felt the folded sheet music there, the photograph of Emma. The doors opened onto a reception area he'd vacuumed 10,000 times but never truly seen. Behind a curved desk of pale wood and glass, a young woman with perfect posture and a practiced smile looked up. "You must be Daniel Sullivan. Welcome to Executive Admin. I'm Rachel Kim, assistant to the facilities management team." She stood, extending her hand. "Ms. Chun asked me to get you settled. Your office is down the hall." "My office." Daniel repeated the words as if they were in a foreign language. "Yes, sir." She led him down a corridor lined with abstract paintings and potted plants, past glass-walled conference rooms where men and women in expensive suits discussed important things in important voices. "Here we are. Corner office, as requested." The room was small but stunning. Windows on 2 walls overlooking the city, a desk made of reclaimed wood, 2 chairs that looked designed by someone famous, a bookshelf waiting to be filled. On the desk sat a nameplate, "Daniel Sullivan, Director of Facilities." "Ms. Chun wanted you to have a good view," Rachel said. "She thought you'd earned it." Earned it. The word felt strange, weighted with implications Daniel couldn't quite process. He'd earned his paychecks for 20 years through sweat and persistence and the slow erosion of his body and dreams. But this felt like something else, like payment for a performance, like hush money dressed up as opportunity. There's a staff meeting at 9, Rachel continued, consulting her tablet. You'll meet your team, 12 people in facilities management, plus the custodial staff. About 40 people total under your supervision. She paused. That includes Carlos Martinez. I understand you two work together. We still do, Daniel said quietly. Or we did. I'm not sure what I am now. Rachel's professional smile faltered slightly, revealing something more human beneath. Change is always disorienting, she said. But Ms. Chun speaks very highly of you. Whatever happened in that boardroom Friday night? She stopped herself. Well, it made an impression. She thinks you deserve this chance. After she left, Daniel stood alone in his office, turning slowly to take it all in. Through one window, he could see the river, its gray surface reflecting the morning light. Through the other, the sprawl of downtown, buildings climbing over each other toward the sky. He thought about all the nights he'd spent cleaning these floors, looking out at these same views while the city slept, wondering what it felt like to be the person whose office this was, whose name was on the door, whose life included corner offices and good views and the assumption of importance. Now he was that person, and he felt like an imposter. His phone buzzed. Emma. First day as director. I'm so proud of you, Dad. Call me when you can. Love you. He told her about the promotion, but not about how it happened. Not about Marcus Whitmore's challenge or the piano or the way the executives had looked at him like he was an animal that had learned an unexpected trick. She didn't need to know that part. She needed to believe that hard work and persistence were enough, that the world rewarded merit, that her father's sudden elevation was the natural result of excellence recognized. The staff meeting was held in a conference room 2 doors down from where he'd played the nocturne. Daniel arrived 5 minutes early, carrying a notepad and pen like a talisman against inadequacy. The faces around the table were a mixture of familiar and strange. Some he'd worked beside for years, others he'd only seen in passing or never seen at all. Carlos sat near the back, his expression carefully neutral, his hands folded on the table. Jennifer Chun entered at precisely 9 o'clock, her heels clicking on the hardwood, her presence commanding immediate attention. She'd been CFO for 3 years, had built a reputation as brilliant but fair, someone who drove hard bargains but kept her word. Daniel had never spoken to her before Friday night. Good morning, everyone. She took her seat at the head of the table. I want to introduce our new Director of Facilities, Daniel Sullivan. Many of you know Daniel already from his work in custodial services. What you may not know is that he's uniquely qualified for this position, not just because of his 20 years of experience with our systems and needs, but because he understands this building and its people better than anyone else in this room. She looked directly at Daniel, and her eyes were kind. Daniel, would you like to say a few words? He stood on shaking legs, facing the 12 people who would now report to him. Half were older than him, veterans of facilities management with degrees in engineering or business administration. The other half were younger, ambitious, already mentally positioning themselves for the next rung up. And in the back, Carlos, his oldest friend in this building, watching with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. I'm not going to pretend this isn't strange, Daniel said. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. A week ago, I was emptying your trash cans. Now I'm supposed to manage facilities budgets and vendor contracts and strategic planning. I know what you're thinking, some of you anyway, that I'm not qualified, that I don't belong here, that this is some kind of diversity publicity stunt or corporate charity case. A few uncomfortable shifts around the table. Jennifer's expression remained neutral, but her posture had straightened. You might be right, Daniel continued. I don't have an MBA. I don't have management training. What I have is 20 years of watching this building work and not work. I know which elevators break down in winter. I know which office thermostats are miscalibrated. I know where water pools on the roof during heavy rain and which bathrooms need additional ventilation, and which floors have the highest turnover because the lighting gives everyone headaches. He was warming to it now, the trembling in his hands beginning to still. I know because I've been paying attention, because when you're invisible, you see things that visible people miss. You see the shortcuts people take, the systems that fail, the inefficiencies that everyone's learned to tolerate because that's just how it is. Carlos was nodding slowly, and Daniel drew strength from it. I don't know if I'll be good at this job, Daniel said, but I promise I'll work harder than anyone in this room to learn what I don't know. And I promise I'll never forget where I came from or the people who are still there, doing the work that keeps this building running while everyone else takes it for granted. He sat down, his heart pounding. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Jennifer began to clap, slow and deliberate. Others joined in, some enthusiastically, some reluctantly, but all participating in the ritual acknowledgement of something said. Thank you, Daniel, Jennifer said. Now, let's talk about the third quarter facilities budget and the HVAC replacement project on floors 12 through 20. The meeting lasted 2 hours, a blur of spreadsheets and timelines and vendor comparisons. Daniel absorbed what he could, took notes on what he couldn't, and felt the weight of his ignorance like a stone in his stomach. These people spoke a language he'd never learned: lead certification and energy efficiency ratios and depreciation schedules. He'd spent 20 years maintaining buildings, but he'd never had to think about how those buildings were financed, regulated, strategized. Afterward, Carlos caught him in the hallway. Can we talk? They found an empty conference room, closed the door. Through the glass walls, people moved past, living their corporate lives, oblivious or uncaring to the small drama unfolding between two middle-aged men who'd spent decades cleaning up after them. This is weird, man, Carlos said. You know it's weird, right? I know. 1 week you're my partner, next week you're my boss. Carlos rubbed his face, and Daniel noticed how tired he looked, how the years had carved deep lines around his eyes. I'm happy for you. I am, but I'm also, I don't know what I am. Angry, Daniel offered. Maybe a little. Not at you. At the situation. Carlos leaned against the table. We've been doing the same work for the same time. What makes you different? What makes you special? Daniel pulled out the photograph of Emma, set it on the table. You want the honest answer? I played piano in front of the CEO. I played well. Surprised him. It made me visible for 30 seconds, and in those 30 seconds, I stopped being just another janitor and became a person. A person with a history, with talent, with worth beyond my function. That's fucked up, Carlos said quietly. Yeah. So what happens to the rest of us? The ones who can't play piano? We just stay invisible forever. Daniel didn't have an answer. He thought about Marcus Whitmore's challenge, about the cruelty disguised as opportunity, about how easily he could have failed and been erased entirely. I'm going to try to change things, he said. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to try. Carlos nodded slowly, then extended his hand. Okay, boss, I'll hold you to that. They shook, and it felt both like a promise and a goodbye, like the end of one relationship and the uncertain beginning of another. The rest of Daniel's first day was a cascade of meetings, introductions, orientations. HR walked him through benefits packages and organizational charts. IT set up his computer and email. The head of security briefed him on emergency procedures and access protocols. Every hour brought new information, new responsibilities, new evidence of how little he understood about the machinery of the organization he'd served for 2 decades. By 6 p.m., his head throbbed, and his suit felt like a costume he couldn't wait to shed. He gathered his things, rode the elevator down to the lobby, and walked out into the cooling evening. The rush hour crowd surged around him, thousands of people heading home after 8 or 10 or 12 hours of contributing to the great engine of commerce that kept the city running. He pulled out his phone, called Emma. Dad, how was it? Tell me everything. Her voice was bright with pride and genuine interest, and Daniel felt the familiar ache of love mixed with the sharper pain of deception. How could he explain what had really happened? How could he tell her that his promotion wasn't about excellence recognized but about a power play gone wrong? About a CEO who'd meant to humiliate him and had accidentally elevated him instead. It was good, he said. Overwhelming but good. My office has windows. Windows? Dad, that's amazing. You deserve this. You've worked so hard for so long. Have I? The question escaped before he could stop it. What do you mean? Daniel stopped walking, stood still while the crowd flowed around him like water around a stone. I've worked hard at surviving, but surviving isn't the same as striving. It's not the same as building something or becoming something. I've just been treading water for 20 years. Silence on the line. Then, you raised me. You took care of Mom when she was sick. You kept a roof over our heads and food on the table and made sure I could go to college without debt. You think that's just survival? I think it's what any parent would do. Maybe, but you did it alone after Mom died. You did it while working 60-hour weeks at a job that broke your body and crushed your dreams. You did it without complaining, without making me feel guilty, without making me responsible for your sacrifices. Her voice caught. Don't diminish what you've done, Dad. Don't pretend it doesn't matter just because it wasn't glamorous. After they hung up, Daniel stood on the corner of 5th and Madison, watching the sky turn from blue to purple to black. Somewhere in this city, Marcus Whitmore was probably having drinks with other CEOs, discussing mergers and markets and the infinite variations of winning. Somewhere, Jennifer Chun was working late, going over spreadsheets, building her reputation as someone who always delivered. Somewhere, Carlos Martinez was probably finishing his shift, going home to his wife and 3 kids, content in the invisibility that came with honest work honestly done. And here was Daniel Sullivan, caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither, carrying in his pocket a photograph and a piece of sheet music and the memory of 30 seconds when he'd been fully, dangerously, irrevocably seen. He rode the bus home, climbed the stairs to his apartment, and sat at his second-hand piano. But tonight he couldn't play. His fingers rested on the keys without pressing, without making sound, as if the music had been used up, spent in a single performance that had cost more than he'd known he was paying. Tuesday brought new challenges. Daniel attended his first executive meeting, sitting in a chair near the back while vice presidents discussed market positioning and competitive advantages and synergistic opportunities. The language was abstract, divorced from the concrete reality of buildings and maintenance and the people who kept systems running. He tried to contribute once, suggesting that the proposed expansion of the 14th floor might cause load-bearing issues, but his concern was politely noted and then ignored. Marcus Whitmore arrived late, striding in with the casual arrogance of someone who knew all conversations would pause for his presence. He glanced at Daniel once, a look so brief it might have been imagined, then took his seat and immediately began discussing the Tokyo merger. After the meeting, Jennifer caught Daniel's arm. "Don't let them intimidate you," she said quietly. "You have as much right to be in that room as anyone." "Do I?" Daniel gestured at the departing executives, their expensive suits and confident bearing and easy fluency in the language of corporate strategy. "I don't speak their language, Jennifer. I don't think their thoughts. I'm a janitor playing dress-up. You're a director learning a new role." Her voice was firm. "And you're bringing a perspective this company desperately needs. Someone who understands that businesses are built on people, not just profit margins." She hesitated, then added, "What Marcus did to you last Friday was wrong, cruel. But what you did in response was extraordinary. Don't forget that." Wednesday morning, Daniel found a note taped to his office door. Asterisk, "Some people earn their positions. Others play their way in. Don't forget which one you are." Asterisk. No signature, but the handwriting was sharp and precise. The letters formed with the kind of aggressive clarity that came from private school education and inherited confidence. Daniel pulled the note down, folded it carefully, and added it to the growing collection of evidence that his presence on the 43rd floor was unwelcome. Inside his office, he found another surprise. Someone had been through his desk drawers. Papers were slightly out of place, his orientation materials scattered across the surface. Nothing was missing, but the invasion was deliberate. A message as clear as the note on his door. "You don't belong here, and we can reach you anytime we want." He sat down slowly, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. 3 days in his new role, and already the mechanisms of corporate rejection were grinding into motion. He thought about reporting it to HR, but what would he say? "Someone left me a mean note and rifled through my desk?" In a building full of cameras and security protocols, The fact that someone could do this meant they had permission, implicit if not explicit, from people higher up the chain. His computer chimed. An email from Thomas Park, VP of Business Development. Daniel, need you to review the maintenance contracts for our Singapore office. Legal wants your sign-off by Friday. Thanks. Daniel stared at the message, then opened the attached documents. 50 pages of dense legal language, specifications for commercial HVAC systems he'd never worked with, liability clauses in a context he barely understood. Thomas Park knew Daniel was new, knew he couldn't possibly provide meaningful analysis in 2 days, but he'd assigned it anyway. A test designed for failure. Another way to prove that the janitor didn't belong in the director's office. He spent the next 6 hours reading through the contracts, taking notes, looking up terms he didn't understand. By noon, his eyes burned. By 3 p.m., his head pounded. By 6 p.m., he developed a nervous tension in his shoulders that felt like wires pulled too tight, ready to snap. Carlos knocked on his door at 6:30, holding 2 cups of coffee from the break room. Thought you might need this. You're a lifesaver. Daniel accepted the cup gratefully, gestured to the chair across from his desk. What are you still doing here? Could ask you the same thing. Carlos settled into the chair with a grunt. Everyone else left 2 hours ago. Even the workaholics on 37. I'm trying to review these contracts for Thomas Park. Daniel rubbed his eyes. I think he's testing me, seeing if I'll drown. And will you? Probably. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. You know what's funny? When I was a custodian, I understood my job completely. I knew what needed to be done, how to do it, when to do it. I was good at it. Really good. Now I'm supposed to be more important, and I have no idea what I'm doing. I can't tell if these contract terms are standard or predatory. I don't know if the proposed maintenance schedules are adequate or insufficient. I'm just guessing. Carlos took a long sip of his coffee. You remember when I first started here? 15 years ago. I remember. You were terrified you'd screw something up. I was. But you told me something that stuck with me. You said, nobody knows what they're doing at first. The difference between the people who make it and the people who don't is that the people who make it keep showing up anyway. Carlos set down his cup. So keep showing up, Danny. Keep learning. Ask for help when you need it. And don't let bastards like Thomas Park make you feel small just because they were born rich. After Carlos left, Daniel worked until 10 p.m., then took the bus home through streets that had gone quiet, past darkened storefronts and shuttered restaurants, through neighborhoods where people lived lives that never intersected with boardrooms or executive decisions or the abstract mathematics of global commerce. His apartment felt smaller than usual, cramped with the physical remnants of Sarah's life that he'd never been able to clear away. Her books still on the shelves, her coffee mugs still in the cupboard, her reading glasses still on the bedside table. He made himself dinner. Rice and beans, the same meal he'd eaten 3 nights a week for 20 years because it was cheap and filling, and ate standing at the kitchen counter while reading through more contract language on his phone. The words blurred together, meaningless chains of legalese that might have been written in another language for all the sense they made to him. His phone rang. Emma, calling from the hospital during a rare break between rounds. Dad, you sound exhausted. Long day. He didn't want to worry her, didn't want to admit that he was drowning, that the promotion she was so proud of might actually be a sophisticated form of punishment. Are they working you too hard? You just started. It's fine, sweetheart. Just learning curve stuff. A pause, and he could hear the hospital sounds in the background. Monitors beeping, announcements over intercoms, the controlled chaos of people fighting against death and illness. Dad, be honest with me. Is this job good for you? Because if it's not, if it's just a different kind of exploitation. It pays more, Daniel interrupted. Almost triple what I was making. That's good, right? That's progress. Only if it doesn't kill you. Her voice was gentle but firm, the voice of someone who'd spent years studying how bodies broke down under stress. Money matters, but so do you. Your health, your well-being, your life outside of work. You gave up so much for me. Don't give up what's left for a title and a salary increase. After they hung up, Daniel sat at his piano and played. Not Chopin this time, but something simpler. something from his childhood. And old him his mother used to sing while cooking dinner, back when he was young enough to believe that goodness was always rewarded and hard work always recognized and the world operated according to rules that made sense. The notes filled his small apartment, leaked through the thin walls to where Mrs. Chan, his elderly neighbor, was probably settling in for the night. She'd lived next door for 12 years, had brought him soup when Sarah was dying, had babysat Emma when Daniel worked double shifts. She'd never asked what he did for a living, never seemed to care about titles or status or where someone fell on the hierarchy of worth. Thursday morning brought rain, cold and relentless, the kind that soaked through clothes and made the city feel gray and defeated. Daniel arrived at Whitmore Industries at 7:30, his suit damp despite the umbrella, his mood matching the weather. In his office, he found another note, this one more direct. Juilliard doesn't mean shit if you can't read a balance sheet. He crumpled it up, threw it in the trash, then immediately retrieved it and smoothed it out. Evidence. He was collecting evidence, though for what purpose he couldn't quite say. Who would he report it to? Marcus Whitmore, who'd orchestrated this whole situation. Jennifer Chun, who'd been kind but whose power had limits. HR, whose job was to protect the company, not individual employees. The day was a cascade of small humiliations disguised as normal operations. In the morning facilities meeting, someone had accidentally left Daniel off the calendar invite, so he arrived 15 minutes late to find his team already deep in discussion. At lunch, he overheard two junior executives laughing about the piano man in the elevator. In the afternoon, Robert Hastings stopped by his office to ask, with exaggerated politeness, whether Daniel could have someone clean up a spill in the executive bathroom. Not realizing or not caring that Daniel was no longer responsible for custodial work. That would be Carlos's team, Daniel said evenly. I can send him up. Oh, right. Sorry. I keep forgetting your management now. Robert's smile was sharp. Though I suppose old habits die hard, don't they? By Thursday evening, Daniel felt like he was coming apart at the seams. The stress of the job itself was manageable. He could learn contracts and budgets and strategic planning, given time. But the constant low-grade warfare, the daily reminders that he was unwelcome, the accumulated weight of 1,000 small rejections, that was grinding him down in ways he didn't know how to combat. He stayed late again, working on the Singapore contracts, trying to formulate questions that wouldn't reveal the depth of his ignorance. Around 8 p.m., he heard footsteps in the hallway. Then Jennifer Chan appeared in his doorway. You're here late, she observed, trying to finish the Singapore review. She entered, closed the door behind her. Can I be frank with you, Daniel? Please. Thomas Park gave you that assignment specifically because he knows you can't complete it adequately in the time frame provided. He's building a case against you. So is Robert Hastings. So are at least 3 other executives who feel that your presence here is... She paused, searching for the right word. Disruptive. Daniel set down his pen. Then why did you support my promotion? Because Marcus's challenge was cruel and unfair, and you met it brilliantly. Because I believe this company needs people who understand its operations from the ground up, not just people who understand spreadsheets. And because... She hesitated. Because I'm tired of watching talented people be crushed by systems designed to keep them in their place. But I'm not winning, Daniel said quietly. I'm barely surviving. Then fight smarter, not harder. Jennifer sat down across from him. The Singapore contracts? I'll have my team review them and give you talking points. The notes on your door? Document everything and send it to me. The exclusion from meetings? I'll make sure you're included. You don't have to do this alone, Daniel. That's what they want. For you to be isolated, overwhelmed, too proud to ask for help until you collapse under the weight. Why are you helping me? She was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. I grew up in San Francisco, daughter of immigrants who ran a dry cleaning business. My father had a PhD in engineering from Seoul National University, but his degree wasn't recognized here. So he pressed shirts for 20 years while my mother altered wedding dresses and told me to study hard. Get good grades. Never let anyone make me small. She met Daniel's eyes. I got into Stanford, then Wharton Business School, then climbed the corporate ladder until I became CFO. But I never forgot what my father told me the day I left for college. The system will try to put you back where it thinks you belong. Don't let it. After she left, Daniel sat alone in his office, watching the rain streak down the windows, turning the city lights into abstract patterns. He thought about his own father, dead now 15 years, who'd worked construction until his body gave out at 62. He thought about Sarah, who'd believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. He thought about Emma, who'd inherited his stubbornness and his refusal to accept that where you started determined where you finished. And he thought about the piano sitting silent in that boardroom, waiting. Friday morning, Daniel submitted his review of the Singapore contracts along with a carefully worded email acknowledging the limitations of his analysis and requesting that the legal team provide additional oversight. It was a compromise, neither complete capitulation nor fraudulent competence, and he suspected Thomas Park would be disappointed not to have caught him in an obvious failure. The afternoon brought the weekly executive briefing, 2 hours of presentations and discussions that Daniel mostly observed in silence, absorbing the rhythms of how decisions were made, who held real power versus formal authority, which alliances mattered and which were performative. Marcus Whitmore ran the meeting with casual dominance, his comments shaping the conversation, his approval or disapproval determining which initiatives lived or died. Near the end, Marcus turned to Daniel. "How's your first week been, Sullivan? Living up to expectations?" The room went quiet. Everyone understood this was a test, a public evaluation disguised as friendly inquiry. "It's been challenging," Daniel said carefully. "I'm learning that management requires a different skill set than operations. But I'm committed to developing those skills." Diplomatic answer. Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let me be more direct. Do you think you're qualified for this position?" Daniel felt every eye in the room on him, waiting to see if he'd claim competence he didn't have or admit inadequacy that would justify his eventual removal. He thought about Jennifer's advice to fight smarter, about Carlos's reminder to keep showing up, about Emma's concern that he was sacrificing himself for a title. "No," he said, "I'm not qualified yet, but I'm learning, and I have the advantage of understanding this building's operations better than anyone else in this room. Give me 6 months and I'll be qualified. Give me a year and I'll be excellent." Marcus held his gaze for a long moment, and Daniel couldn't read what passed behind those cold gray eyes. Then the CEO nodded slightly and moved on to the next agenda item, leaving Daniel uncertain whether he'd passed the test or merely postponed his failure. After the meeting, Robert Hastings caught up with him in the hallway. "Bold move in there. Admitting you're unqualified. Seemed better than pretending otherwise." "Maybe." Robert lowered his voice. "Look, I'm going to be straight with you. A lot of people here think you're a diversity project, Marcus's way of proving he cares about social mobility or whatever. They're waiting for you to fail so they can confirm their assumptions about people like you." "People like me?" "You know what I mean. People who didn't come up through the traditional paths. People who didn't go to the right schools, don't have the right background, don't speak the language." Robert shrugged. "I'm not saying I agree with them. I'm just telling you how it is." "And where do you stand?" Daniel asked. Robert considered the question. "I think that piano performance was either the luckiest break of your life or the worst thing that could have happened to you. Time will tell which." He walked away, leaving Daniel standing alone in the corridor, watching executives stream past on their way to important meetings and important decisions, all of them moving with the confidence of people who'd never had to question whether they belonged. That evening, Daniel took the train across town to visit Emma at her apartment, a tiny studio in a building full of other residents and medical students, all of them young and exhausted and idealistic in ways that made his heart ache. She made dinner, pasta with vegetables, simple but good, and they ate at her small table while she told him about her day, about the patients she'd treated and the procedures she'd assisted with and the attending physician who was brilliant but cruel. "Does it ever feel like you're in over your head?" Daniel asked. "Like everyone around you is more qualified, more prepared, more deserving of being there?" Emma set down her fork, studied her father's face. "Every single day," she said. "But here's what I've learned. Everyone feels that way, even the attendings who act like gods. Even the department heads with 40 years of experience. We're all just doing our best with incomplete information, trying not to hurt people while we figure things out. But you went to medical school. You trained for this. And you've been training for 20 years, Emma countered. Just because your training happened on the job instead of in a classroom doesn't make it less valuable. Dad, you know things those executives could never learn from an MBA program. You know how buildings work, how systems fail, how to solve problems with limited resources. That's worth something. Is it worth the stress? The humiliation? Only you can answer that. She reached across the table, took his hand. But I'll tell you what I think. I think you've spent 20 years being invisible, and now you have a chance to be seen. To use your knowledge and experience to make real changes, to help people who are still invisible, to prove that the hierarchy everyone takes for granted is just a story we tell ourselves about who matters and who doesn't. After dinner, they sat on her tiny balcony, looking out at the city lights, and Daniel told her about the piano performance, about Marcus's challenge and Jennifer's support, and the daily accumulation of small cruelties that was wearing him down. He told her about the notes on his door and the deliberate exclusion from meetings and the constant questioning of his competence and his worth. They're trying to make you quit, Emma said. They're hoping you'll decide it's not worth it and go back to being invisible. Maybe I should. Is that what Mom would say? Daniel closed his eyes, remembering Sarah in their small apartment, working 2 jobs while he tried and failed to make it as a concert pianist, never once suggesting that his dreams were unrealistic or that he should give up and be practical. She'd believed in him longer than he'd believed in himself, had mourned his surrender to necessity more than he'd mourned it, had kept his sheet music and photographs and recordings like evidence of who he'd been before life forced him into a smaller shape. She'd tell me to fight, he said quietly. She'd tell me that some battles are worth losing yourself in, even if you're not sure you can win. Then fight. Emma squeezed his hand. Not for the title or the salary or to prove something to people who've already decided you're not good enough. Fight because there are other Daniel Sullivans out there. Talented, experienced, invisible people who deserve a chance. Fight to change the system that keeps them hidden. Fight to prove that worth isn't determined by birth or education, or how well you perform in someone else's definition of success. On the train ride home, Daniel thought about his daughter's words, about Sarah's memory, about the 20 years he'd spent being invisible, and the single moment of visibility that had changed everything. He thought about Carlos and Marcus Washington and all the other people he'd worked beside, people whose intelligence and dedication and humanity were rendered meaningless by their position in the hierarchy. And he thought about the piano, sitting silent in that boardroom, and what it would mean to play it again, not as a performance to prove his worth, but as an act of defiance against a system designed to keep him small. Saturday morning, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He went to visit Mrs. Kowalski, his old piano teacher. She lived in assisted living now, in a facility on the edge of the city where the buildings were lower and the streets were quieter and the pace of life had slowed to something closer to human scale. He found her in the common room, playing an upright piano for a small audience of residents. Her fingers still nimble despite her 86 years. She finished her piece, Brahms, something gentle and autumnal, and the residents applauded politely. Then she turned and saw Daniel, and her face lit up with recognition and joy that made his chest tight. Daniel Sullivan. After all these years. They sat in her small apartment, drinking tea she'd made too strong, surrounded by photographs of students she'd taught over 5 decades of patient dedication to an art that paid poorly but mattered anyway. She asked about his life, and he found himself telling her everything. The custodial work, Sarah's death, Emma's success, the piano performance that had changed his circumstances if not his status. "Play for me," she said when he finished. "Really play, not to prove anything just because you can." So he sat at her upright piano, old and slightly out of tune but full of character, and he played. Not the nocturne this time, but something else. A Beethoven sonata he'd loved as a teenager, full of drama and passion and the kind of emotional honesty that felt dangerous in corporate boardrooms. He played the way he used to play before life taught him to be careful, before survival became more important than expression, before he learned that some parts of yourself had to be hidden to get by in the world. When he finished, Mrs. Kowalski was crying silently, tears running down her weathered face. "You're still there," she said. "The musician you were, the artist. He's still there, underneath everything else you've had to become." "I don't know if that's good or bad," Daniel admitted. "It's both. It's always both." She reached for his hand, held it with surprising strength. "Daniel, I taught you technique and theory and how to interpret the composers. But the most important thing I tried to teach you, the thing I'm not sure you learned, is that music isn't about perfection. It's about truth. About expressing what's real, even when what's real is messy or painful or doesn't fit into neat categories." "What does that have to do with my job?" "Everything," she smiled. "You're surrounded by people who've learned to perform perfection, to present a polished version of themselves that fits corporate expectations. But you're still learning how to do that. You're still awkward, still rough around the edges, still real in ways that make them uncomfortable. Don't lose that, Daniel. Don't learn to be smooth and polished and fake. The world has enough of those people already." Sunday, Daniel spent cleaning his apartment, doing laundry, preparing meals for the week ahead. All the domestic maintenance that kept life functioning. But his mind was elsewhere, turning over Mrs. Kowalski's words, thinking about truth and performance and the different kinds of masks people wore. In the evening, he called Carlos. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure, boss." "Stop calling me that. I'm serious." Daniel paused, trying to articulate what he'd been thinking. "When I was promoted, did it change how you saw me? Not just our professional relationship, but who I am?" Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "It did. You're the same person, but you're also not. You're caught between worlds now, not quite one of us anymore, but not really one of them either. It's like you're in limbo, and I don't know how to relate to you there. That's what I was afraid of." "But here's the thing," Carlos continued. "Maybe that's not a bad place to be. Maybe we need people in limbo, people who understand both sides, who can translate between the visible and invisible. You just have to figure out how to survive it without losing yourself." After they hung up, Daniel sat at his piano and played. Not Chopin or Beethoven or any of the classical repertoire that had defined his training, but something he'd been composing in his head over the past week. It was simple, almost childlike in its melody, but underneath ran a current of complexity, of tensions unresolved and questions unanswered. He played it through several times, refining it, letting it evolve, until it began to sound like something he could recognize. Not quite joy, not quite sorrow, but something in between. Something that felt like truth. Monday morning arrived with the weight of a second week, and Daniel returned to Whitmore Industries with the sense that he was entering a battlefield where the weapons were politeness and the casualties were invisible. He arrived early, before 7, and found Jennifer Chun already in her office. "Can we talk?" he asked. She gestured him in, closed the door. "You survived week 1. That's farther than some people expected you to get." "I want to make some changes," Daniel said, "to how facilities are managed, to how we treat the custodial staff, to how decisions are made about building maintenance and improvements." Jennifer leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Go on." "The custodial staff, they're paid minimum wage, no benefits, no job security. They know this building better than anyone, but their knowledge is never consulted when we make decisions about renovations or system upgrades. They're invisible, and that invisibility is built into the structure of how this company operates. And you want to change that." "I want to try." Daniel pulled out a folder he'd prepared over the weekend, full of proposals he'd written and rewritten until his eyes burned. "I want to raise their wages. I want to create a pathway for advancement, training programs, mentorship. I want to institutionalize their input into facilities decisions. I want to make them visible." Jennifer took the folder, flipped through it slowly. "This would cost money. Not much in the context of our overall budget. And it would save money in the long term, lower turnover, better maintenance, fewer emergency repairs. It would also challenge the hierarchy. It would suggest that the people at the bottom have value beyond their immediate function. That makes a lot of executives uncomfortable." She set down the folder. "But I like it. I'll present it to Marcus. Will he approve it?" "I don't know." But I think you should be the one to present it, not me. Jennifer's expression was serious. You need to show them you're not just surviving in this role, you're actually contributing, thinking strategically, proposing meaningful changes. This is your chance to prove you belong here. Daniel felt his stomach drop. The thought of standing in front of the executive team, presenting proposals that would challenge their assumptions and require their approval, filled him with a dread that felt physical. But he nodded, accepting the challenge, because what else could he do? The presentation was scheduled for Friday afternoon, which gave him 4 days to prepare, for days to refine his proposals and rehearse his arguments and try to anticipate every objection and counter-argument the executives would raise. He worked late every night, surviving on coffee and determination, while around him the building emptied out and filled up again with the custodial staff who would never see the proposals being made on their behalf. On Wednesday night, Carlos found him still working at 9 p.m. You're going to burn yourself out. I'm trying to change things for you, for everyone. Carlos sat down heavily. Danny, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you need to understand something. Most of us don't want to be managers or directors. We just want to be paid fairly and treated with dignity. We want to be able to support our families without working 80 hours a week. We want to be seen as human beings, not just functions. That's what I'm proposing. Good. Then make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Not to prove yourself to them, not to justify your promotion, but because it's the right thing to do. Carlos stood. And remember, if they reject your proposals, it doesn't mean the proposals are wrong. It means the system is. Friday afternoon arrived with terrible inevitability. Daniel dressed carefully in his Goodwill suit, gathered his materials, and walked to the conference room where the executive team was waiting. Marcus Whitmore sat at the head of the table, flanked by Robert Hastings and Thomas Park, with Jennifer Chan and the others arranged around the perimeter like pieces on a chessboard. Daniel, Marcus gestured to the chair at the opposite end of the table. Jennifer tells me you have some proposals for facilities management improvements. We're listening. Daniel stood, sitting felt too passive, too defeated, and launched into his presentation. He talked about turnover costs and emergency repair expenses and the institutional knowledge being lost every time an experienced custodian left for a better-paying job. He showed spreadsheets and charts and comparative analyses. He quoted studies on employee satisfaction and productivity. He made the business case as clearly and compellingly as he could. But underneath the numbers and the data, he told a different story, about people who worked in shadows, who kept systems running while everyone else took credit, who had intelligence and skills and dreams that were invisible to the people who benefited from their labor. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Thomas Park spoke, his voice cool and skeptical. These proposals would increase our facilities budget by 12%. That's significant. It would save us 15% in long-term costs, Daniel countered. Lower turnover, fewer emergency repairs, better preventive maintenance. That's speculative, Robert Hastings said. What you're really proposing is social engineering, using company resources to address inequality instead of maximizing efficiency. I'm proposing treating people with dignity while simultaneously improving our operations, Daniel replied. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. The arguments went back and forth for 30 minutes, with Daniel defending his proposals against skepticism, hostility, and deliberate misunderstanding. He felt himself getting frustrated, felt his voice rising, felt the precarious control he'd maintained for 2 weeks beginning to slip. Then Marcus Whitmore raised his hand, and the room fell silent. I'm going to approve these proposals, he said. All of them. The executives stared at him in shock. Jennifer Chen's eyebrows rose. Daniel felt his heart stutter. But, Marcus continued, his gray eyes fixed on Daniel, I'm approving them with a condition. You have 6 months to show measurable improvements in turnover, maintenance costs, and operational efficiency. If you succeed, your proposals become permanent policy and you keep your position. If you fail, everything reverts to how it was, and you're terminated. It was a trap disguised as an opportunity, another test designed to prove Daniel's inadequacy. 6 months to change systems that had been in place for decades, to overcome institutional resistance, to transform the invisible into the visible. all while learning a job he barely understood and fighting against executives who wanted him to fail. But what choice did he have except to accept? "Deal," Daniel said. Marcus smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd just secured his prey. "Excellent. I look forward to seeing your results. Jennifer, work with Daniel to implement these changes. Everyone else." Meeting adjourned. As the executives filed out, Jennifer caught Daniel's arm. "You know what you just agreed to, right? He's setting you up to fail." "I know. And you're going to try anyway?" Daniel thought about Carlos and Marcus Washington and all the other invisible people he'd worked beside for 20 years. He thought about Sarah and Emma and Mrs. Kowalski. He thought about the musician he'd been and the janitor he'd become and the director he was trying to be. "Yeah," he said. "I'm going to try anyway." The implementation of Daniel's proposals began on Monday morning with a mandatory meeting of the entire custodial staff. 43 people gathered in a break room designed for 15, standing shoulder to shoulder while Daniel explained changes that most of them didn't believe would actually happen. Starting next pay period, everyone's hourly wage increases by $3, he announced, and watched skepticism ripple through the crowd. "In 3 months, we'll implement a comprehensive benefits package including health insurance, dental, and vision coverage. We're also creating advancement pathways, opportunities to move into specialized maintenance roles, supervisory positions, and eventually facilities management." Maria Rodriguez, who'd worked custodial for 12 years, raised her hand. "Why now? What changed?" Daniel could have given them the sanitized version, that management recognized the value of their contributions, that efficiency studies showed investment in workers paid dividends, that this was simply good business. Instead, he told them the truth. "I got promoted because I could play piano, and it made me visible for 30 seconds. That's it. That's the only reason I'm standing here instead of standing there with you. It's arbitrary and unfair and wrong." He looked around the room at faces weathered by years of hard work and low pay. "I can't fix the system that makes people invisible, but I can try to make it a little less brutal for those of us caught in it." The room remained silent, processing this admission. Then Carlos stepped forward. "So what do you need from us?" "Patience, feedback, honesty, and probably forgiveness when I screw things up, because I'm learning as I go." Daniel distributed packets containing the new policies, wage scales, training schedules. "This is real. I promise you it's real. But it's also fragile. It can disappear if we don't prove it works. So I need you to help me prove it works." Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel threw himself into implementation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He met with HR to process payroll changes, with training vendors to develop skills programs, with union representatives to negotiate contract modifications. He worked 70-hour weeks, arrived before dawn and left after dark, sustained by coffee and stubbornness, and the growing awareness that he was racing against a clock he couldn't see. The executives watched his efforts with varying degrees of amusement, skepticism, and hostility. Thomas Park sent him increasingly complex assignments: contract reviews, budget analyses, strategic planning documents, all with impossible deadlines, all designed to overwhelm him. Robert Hastings questioned every expenditure, demanded justification for every policy change, created procedural obstacles that slowed implementation to a crawl. But the most insidious resistance came from the middle managers, the supervisors and team leads who'd built their small empires on maintaining the existing hierarchy. They saw Daniel's proposals as threats to their authority, challenges to the order that gave their lives meaning. Frank Morrison, facilities supervisor for 20 years, confronted Daniel in his office during the 3rd week. "You're destroying morale," Frank said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "These people, the custodial staff, they understood their place. They knew what was expected. Now you've got them thinking they deserve more, expecting more, demanding more. You're making them dissatisfied with work they used to do without complaint." "They should be dissatisfied," Daniel replied. "They're underpaid and undervalued. They're unskilled labor. They're replaceable. That's the reality of the market." Frank leaned forward, his hands flat on Daniel's desk. "You think you're being kind, being progressive, but what you're really doing is setting them up for disappointment. This initiative of yours will fail. Marcus is making sure of that. And when it does, everything reverts. Except now these people will know what they're missing, what they could have had. You're making their lives worse, not better. Get out of my office, Daniel said quietly. Or what? You'll fire me? Frank laughed. You don't have that authority, Sullivan. You're a janitor playing dress-up. In 6 months, you'll be gone, and everything will go back to normal. After Frank left, Daniel sat alone, staring at his hands. They were shaking slightly, adrenaline and rage mixing into something that felt like nausea. He pulled out his phone, almost called Emma, then stopped. What would he tell her? That Frank was probably right? That he was setting people up for disappointment? That his efforts to help might actually cause more harm? His computer chimed. An email from Marcus Whitmore. See me in my office. Now, Marcus's office occupied the corner of the 48th floor, a massive space with windows on 3 sides and furniture that probably cost more than Daniel had earned in his entire custodial career. The CEO sat behind a desk of polished granite, reviewing documents with the focused intensity of someone who wielded power as naturally as breathing. Sit down, Sullivan. Marcus didn't look up. I've been reviewing your implementation progress. You're behind schedule on the training program rollout. You're over budget on the wage increases. And I'm hearing complaints from middle management about your communication style. Frank Morrison is resistant to change, Daniel said. So are several others. They see these reforms as threats to their authority. Maybe they are. Marcus finally looked up, his gray eyes cold and assessing. You're disrupting established hierarchies, questioning systems that have worked for decades, making people uncomfortable. Daniel stood, his heart pounding but his voice steady. You're right. I am disrupting established hierarchies, because those hierarchies are built on the assumption that some people matter more than others based on arbitrary credentials rather than actual worth. Marcus's expression hardened. Careful, Sullivan. You're in this office because I allowed it. No, Daniel said quietly. I'm in this office because you tried to humiliate me and it backfired. You thought the janitor couldn't play Chopin. You were wrong. Now you're betting I can't manage facilities reform. Maybe you're wrong about that too. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed. A sound without humor but carrying grudging respect. You know what your problem is, Sullivan? You actually believe this matters. You think changing wages and creating training programs will somehow transform the fundamental nature of how the world works. Maybe it won't transform the world, Daniel replied, but it might transform 43 lives. Isn't that enough? 6 months later, the results were undeniable. Turnover had dropped by 60%. Emergency maintenance costs were down 18%. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements. More importantly, 3 custodial workers had completed training programs and moved into specialized maintenance roles. Maria Rodriguez was enrolled in night classes for facilities management. Carlos had become a mentor for new hires. Marcus kept his word. The reforms became permanent policy. Daniel kept his position, but nothing else changed. The executives still viewed him with suspicion. Middle managers still resisted his authority, and he remained caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. On the anniversary of his piano performance, Daniel returned to the boardroom after hours. The Steinway sat in its corner, black and pristine, untouched since that Friday evening. He'd honored Marcus's command not to play it until now. He sat down, lifted the fallboard, and began. Not Chopin this time, but the piece he'd been composing, simple, complex, unresolved. The music filled the empty boardroom, leaked into the corridor where the night custodial staff moved through their rounds. Marcus appeared in the doorway. They didn't speak. Daniel kept playing while the CEO listened, and in that moment, something passed between them that wasn't quite understanding but wasn't quite animosity either. An acknowledgement that they'd both been changed by a challenge meant to prove superiority and had instead revealed something more complicated about worth and visibility and the arbitrary nature of the hierarchies that govern their world. The final note faded. Daniel closed the fallboard and stood. Same time next week? Marcus asked quietly. Daniel smiled. Same time next week. He left the building through the main entrance, not the service door. Behind him, the lights of Whitmore Industries blazed against the night sky. 48 floors of ambition and hierarchy and people trying to matter. And on one of those floors, a piano waited, proof that some performances changed everything while changing nothing, that visibility was both burden and gift, and that the distance between janitor and director was simultaneously immense and meaningless. Thank you for listening to the story of Daniel Sullivan's journey from invisibility to recognition. If this tale of resilience, dignity, and the courage to challenge unjust hierarchies resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest narratives, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Have you ever felt invisible in your workplace? What would you play if given your own moment to be seen? Your stories matter to us. Subscribe now and join our community of listeners who believe that everyone deserves to be heard.